All right, let's open our Bibles this morning to Mark chapter 8, verse 1. Mark writes of the lessons he learned about Jesus from the recollections of the Apostle Peter, who was his mentor, his friend, who had led him to the Lord. And Mark was most impressed with how Jesus tirelessly committed himself to getting the word out about life. He served without hesitation. He committed himself tirelessly to the lost. He was always available. And so Mark's book is filled with action. Not so many sermons as just the actions of our Lord as he calls us to follow his example of being servants. Look, your life isn't very long. And what you do for Jesus is going to last. And Mark was moved by that. Well, last Sunday, we went with the disciples and Jesus up to the Galilee area north into Phoenicia, the Decapolis. Two Gentiles were touched by the Lord, a woman who came with persistent faith for her daughter who had been possessed by the devil, a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment brought to Jesus by his friends. But both of them Gentiles, both of them touched by the Lord through intercession of others. And really, as this third year or the 2.5-year mark of Jesus' public ministry, the word is getting out to the Gentiles that they also are to be saved. Well, this morning we have a familiar story, but it isn't really familiar. It's almost a repetition, if you will. We're going to look at 4,000 men plus women and children that Matthew tells us in chapter 15 was in this same area, predominantly Gentile in nature, the Decapolis area before Jesus would return to the west side of the lake. And so we'd like to look at 21 verses this morning because it's one story that is set in the 10 verses, then 3 verses of interruption, if you will, that the Lord uses to train his disciples. But if you remember 5 weeks ago, I think it was, when we were in towards the end of chapter 6 of Mark, the Lord had fed 5,000. You remember that? 5,000 men plus women and children? Maybe 15,000 people in all. He's in the Golan Heights in the northern part of Israel. It had followed the return of the 12 apostles who had been sent out to try it out, filled with the Spirit, 2 by 2, going before Jesus. It made them all the more popular, certainly. We don't know how long they were gone. We do know that when they returned, as the Lord was pulling them aside to counsel and to comfort and to kind of debrief them, that it was then that so many people came that day that the Lord used that gathering of the people to kind of test the disciples. And the similarities between that story 5 weeks ago and this one are such that there are Bible commentators, and not a few, who will tell you that this is the same story, just told with a little different bit of circumstances. I should just tell you those commentators are absolutely wrong. At the time of the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples were challenged to come up with a solution. They were given most of the day. Their response through Philip was pretty much, we don't have that kind of money, nor do we have those kind of resources. They just came to the conclusion it couldn't be done. Jesus had them sit these 15 or 20,000 people, the large crowd in groups of 50 and 100, on the grass. It was the time of the April, or of the spring, if you will. The Lord prayed one time over the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. When everyone was done eating, there were 12 baskets of food left over. This morning, in the feeding of the 4,000, the apostles left the problem to Jesus. The crowds had been with him for 3 days. They were asked to sit on the ground. This was the fall. Nothing was growing. 2 prayers were offered by Jesus, not just one. The audience was mostly Gentile. The food that was multiplied were 7 loaves and a few fish. There were 7 large baskets of food left over. Those are all distinctions, but here's the most important one. Look at verse 19 for a minute. Jesus will say, and we'll get to this towards the end of the study this morning, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments did you take? And they said, 12. And the Lord said, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets of fragments did you take up? And they said, 7. So here's my argument. Jesus is either completely confused and the critics are right, or the critics are just wrong. 2 distinct examples, and they are meant to be that way because the lesson of the story for us this morning is about remembering. Now let's read verse 1 down through verse 10. In those days, the multitude being very great, having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said to them, I've compassion on the multitude. They've now continued with me for 3 days. They've nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their own homes, they will faint on the way. Some of them have come from afar. The disciples said to Jesus, how can anyone satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. He commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them, gave them to his disciples, set before them, and they set them before the multitude. And then also they had a few small fish. Having blessed them, he said to them also before them, and so they ate and were filled. They took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments, and those who had eaten were about 4,000, Matthew adds, plus women and children. And he sent them away, immediately getting into the boat with his disciples and going to the region of the Dalmanutha. So here's the lesson. You learn by repetition. I think if you read this story and you maybe were reading through the Bible and you got to Mark chapter 6, and now you get 6 months later in the story, but just 20 minutes later and you're reading to chapter 8, and you say to yourself, these guys are knuckleheads. By now, they should have gotten the lesson. And you're right, they should have. And as you read the story, you shake your head at the apostles, but I think sometimes the Lord looks at us and goes, these guys are knuckleheads. I told them already, and now they don't listen. I told them last week, and now they've forgotten. Repetition is an important way for us to learn. I think we're getting, our smartphones are making us dumber, right? You don't have to remember your phone number. You just have to remember to push a button, get to here. You don't need to know anything. You can talk into it. You don't need nothing. Just as long as the battery works, we're good to go, right? But the minute it stops, oh man, I don't know where to turn. I have people introduce themselves on Sundays to me. They'll come up and visit. Maybe they're from out of the state or something. They listen on the radio. And I try so hard to remember names. I'm terrible at it. I used to depend on my wife, and I go, honey, and she goes, James, it's James. Now she don't remember either. Now we're, hey, bro, how are you? Man, there is something about practice, and practice and repetition is good for us in almost everything we do, but it is also extremely important in our biblical growth spiritually before the Lord. Truths that we need to take to heart. Practice doesn't make perfect, but man, it sure can help. After having fed the 5,000, you might remember that Jesus preached the following day in John chapter 6, this sermon about being the bread of life. And he said to the crowds, I'm the bread of life. Your fathers, they ate manna in the wilderness. They're dead. This is the bread, speaking of himself, which comes down from heaven, that if you eat, you'll not die. I am the living bread which comes down from heaven. If you eat of this bread, you'll live forever. And Jesus made this connection, and the disciples certainly were there, between the feeding of the people in the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, for example, where 3 million people almost were kept alive for 40 years simply by the manna that fell from heaven. If you look at the description in Exodus 16, I think it's Krispy Kreme donuts, I'm not sure, but they look pretty good, And it kept folks going, and no one, they survived it all, and no one went without. And yet it sustained their physical lives, and then they died in the wilderness. But Jesus is saying to the crowds, just a couple of weeks earlier, look, I'm the manna. The word manna in Hebrew means, what is it? I'm the one who has come that if you will eat of me, just like your fathers ate in the wilderness and survived, though they physically died, you can eat of me and spiritually live. You'll never die. And the boys had heard it. They had watched it. They'd participated in the feeding. The analogy of body and bread and physical and spiritual by repetition was something that they could have caught by now, certainly. Paul will say to the Corinthians years later, I received from the Lord, which I delivered also to you, that the Lord took on the same night which he was betrayed bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it and said, here, eat. This is my body, broken for you. And the analogy stayed the same. The problem was, the disciples weren't learning through the repetition. They were hearing it, they were seeing it, but it never got into their life. Here Jesus is presenting himself as the bread of life, not only to the Jews, but to the Gentiles. Now, if you begin reading in verse 1 and 2 and 3, if you're rooting for the apostles, you expect them to have the right answer by the time you get to verse 4, don't you? You expect them to say, oh, I remember a few months ago, Lord. We had the same situation, and I remember we were wrong then, but we're going to get this right this time. But they don't. They don't get it at all. They should have said, Jesus, you can do the impossible. Notice verse 1, the multitudes were extremely large. There were tons of people following. This is the second largest one-seating food giving out that we have in the Bible. And somehow they missed it. Jesus says the same thing in verse 2 that he said in verse 34 of chapter 6. I'm moved with compassion for the people, their physical well-being, their spiritual needs. But I love the tremendous hunger that he finds amongst the Gentiles. You know, for 3 days they had gone into the wilderness with 3 days apparently worth of food, and they were out of food. But they didn't care. They were hungry for the Lord. And when you come hungry for the Lord, he doesn't disappoint you. But the miracle that takes place here through Jesus' hands and the apostles' job of handling, if you will, the food is familiar. It should have brought immediate recognition to these guys. And it doesn't. Because repetition is necessary if things are going to get settled into our hearts. We can't learn good lessons immediately. We're not that quick, nor that slick. We just don't seem to be able to take it all in. But by the time they leave this big group of people, every mouth is filled, and the Lord has done it again. I suspect that if the Lord had given them an opportunity to give him an answer as to what to do, they might very well have said what they said all along. Just get rid of them, Lord. It's a wilderness area. We're out of luck here, and so are they. They got to go home. Jesus kind of cuts them off this time. He tells his disciples who had no clue, if I send them home like this, they're going to faint along the way. Some of them come from a long way away. And he doesn't really ask for their opinion. He finally just says, what do you have on hand? And they said, well, we have 7 loaves of pita bread. We have 7 loaves, and we got a few fish. And so we read in verse 6 and 7 that much like before, the Lord has them sit down the multitudes on the ground, and Jesus prays over the bread and hands it out, and then he prays over the fish a second time and hands it out again, and everyone gets food. Now, praying before a meal was very Jewish in practice. Praying twice over a meal was not. So the Gentiles get to see something that the Jews did, and Jesus prayed over every portion that was given to them so that they might understand that their dependence upon God was for everything. And it's very distinct. And again, as before, the disciples go out to serve. And verse 8 tells us that when everyone was eaten, they were all, and the word filled is the Greek word kortazo. It means to be glutted. It's kind of like if you're getting a free meal, I'm getting the most out of it. And they did. It was coming out their gills. Now, back in chapter 6, when the feeding was over, there were 12 baskets left of food. The Greek word there is kophinos. It means small basket, small wicker basket, if you will. So 12 baskets of food. Here they gathered spuris. Spuris is a large, like, laundry hamper. 7 big baskets. They're called large here, large baskets of food. In Acts 9, verse 25, Paul is let down from the wall at night to get out of the city in a large basket. This is the word that is used. So 12 baskets representing the 12 tribes of Israel, I suspect, and how the Lord has come to save. 7 baskets with the Gentiles. The number 6 in the Bible, when it is used in a spiritual sense, metaphoric sense, is the number of man. It's the number of failure. You didn't quite get there, right? 7 is the number of perfection and of God's completeness. So interestingly enough, they have 7 baskets. God can provide every need. Now, I don't think that they understood any of that, but just to say the hungry went away full. Last time, 5,000 plus women and children. Now, 4,000 plus women and children. Some of the situational things were different, but in both cases, Jesus fed the hungry, and they were filled. Now, the last time they had come to try to take Jesus by force. Do you remember that? To make him king, and he sent the disciples away. He didn't want them to get caught up in that at all. This time in verse 10, he just gets in the boat after he feeds the 4,000. He sends them away and gets into a boat, and he crosses over to the Dalmanutha region. He gets his disciples away. But here's the point. 2 amazing miracles that involved thousands of people being fed, and they hadn't learned a thing. Right? The repetition for the Jews and also for the Gentiles, and there was not one truth that stuck with them. In fact, when we get to verse 14 and the Lord speaks to them about it, it's an amazing thought that they would be this dull. But let me just remind you, I think the Lord sees us that way. I think it's the same issue. You know, you can hear it 100 times, but unless it becomes a part of your life, it doesn't do you any good. If I were to ask you this question, what truth about God have you permanently learned in the last month that has revolutionized the way that you walk? What have you learned about God or the character of God or of the nature of God? Something God has taught you that has moved you ahead spiritually to maturity, that's put some meat on your faith bones. that you can say to people, this is what God has been teaching me, and I'm different because of this. I pray differently, I live differently, I worry about things in a different manner. First, the enemies of Jesus were waiting the last time, and here the enemies of God are waiting again. But first, the lesson can't be forgotten. What could you share with us? If I say, hey, come up and tell us what God has taught you, really taught you, that's now a part of your life, could you have an answer? Because the disciples, we look and we go, what a bunch of stupid guys. You just served like 100 million, seemed like people over there. Now you're doing it again. You go, amazing. Well, before we get to the answer, the Lord inserts this for us, that as the Lord landed there in the Dalmanutha region, that the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with Jesus. The word dispute means to argue loudly, by the way, or openly, seeking from him a sign from heaven, and they were testing him, but he sighed deeply in his spirit. He said, why does this generation seek after a sign? I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. And he left them, and he got into the boat again, and now he crossed over again to a more familiar part of the countryside. So crossing over Dalmanutha, by the way, is the Magdala area. That was where he, in Mark 7, had ran into those same guys arguing about ceremonial washing. Remember that? That they had said, well, your disciples don't wash their hands. By the tradition, the Lord said, well, you've broken the word of God through your dumb traditions, and talked about the cleaning of the heart. This time, Matthew tells us, and Mark gives us part of it, that the Pharisees came along with, Matthew says, the Sadducees, to confront Jesus publicly. He was getting way too popular. They wanted to put him in his place. Here's their second argument. Yeah, we're going to need some verification from heaven that you're really the Messiah. We're going to need to see some kind of sign so that we can believe in who you are. The last time they had been confronting Jesus, they said he was powerful because he was in league with the devil, right? I think that's back in chapter 3. Now they come to chide him that his works weren't proof enough that they would need a sign from heaven to verify who he was. Now these groups are interesting because the Pharisees were the religious folks of the day. They quoted the Bible, they believed in spiritual things, they were big on outward tradition, but they didn't believe God. And Jesus has some pretty harsh words for them if you want to read them in Matthew 23. He really lets them have it. They came with the Sadducees who by definition would never have gotten along with Pharisees. Sadducees were the humanists of the day. They believed that once you died, you were dead. No spirit, no afterlife, no heaven, no hell, no God. They were powerful kind of government people whose idea of power and wealth was their ultimate goal. So they didn't get along. In fact, the best way to remember them, if you don't believe in heaven or hell, you should be Sadducee. And that's what they believed. They were Sadducees. Well, they began to argue with Jesus out loud, and they demanded this sign from heaven to test him, to tempt him. Pretty wicked request in light of everything that he had done. And notice that Jesus sighed. Now, we had that word last week in verse 34 where the Lord, in going to minister to that man who couldn't speak, just sighed. He was brokenhearted by his condition. It's a word that means to be emotionally invested to where it has a physical effect. This time, I suspect that the sighing was anger. In fact, certainly the words that he speaks would bring that up as well. He was angry at their wicked hearts. It affected him. And he said, why does this generation always be after signs? Now, Dr. Luke in Acts chapter 1 said that Jesus did for 3.5 years infallible proofs. Or if you will, he did things that would leave no doubt as to who he was. I mean, who else in the story or in that generation was healing the sick and cleansing the lepers and casting demons out of lives and opening the eyes of the blind and even raising the dead? Well, no one had done that. They had plenty to go on, but they weren't willing to respond to it. The information isn't sufficient if it isn't internalized. Kind of how repetition works. If you don't hear it and follow. Now, Matthew gives us the rest of the conversation, and the reason we don't have it in Mark is Mark wrote to Gentiles. So when Jesus says, I won't give you any sign except the sign of the prophet Jonah, the Gentiles would have went, Jonah who? The Jews that Matthew wrote to fully understood it, but Jesus said there in Matthew, You can look up in the evening and say, well, it's going to be fair weather because the skies are red. Or you can get up in the morning and say, we're going to have bad weather because the skies are red. And the Lord said you can discern the skies and the signs of the weather, but you can't discern the signs of the times. And it's only a wicked and adulterous generation that would seek a sign. And you're only going to get one, the sign of the prophet Jonah. And Jonah's lesson, if nothing else, was, he was dead for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of this great fish, and he came to life again. And it's a symbol that Jesus uses for the resurrection. So Mark doesn't, like I said, record what Matthew does because of his audience, but the lesson is the same. This is a wicked generation. If you don't have, enough to go on, I understand that. But look, you have plenty to go on, and the wickedness comes in not taking what you know and acting upon it. So the lesson stays the same. The disciples, in a favorable way, were not learning what they were continually being said. The enemies of God, in the same manner, were refusing what was evidence enough to believe in him. Well, then we turn in verse 14 to the disciples. As they leave in the boat again, very abruptly, and maybe the worst thing, and you read it here, is that the Lord just says this to him and he leaves. And I always read in the scripture, and it always kind of scares me when the Lord just turns his back on you and sails away. But if you ignore the obvious and refuse to accept what he has shown you, there's nothing else he can help you with. Here you go. I don't believe it. Okay. I don't have anything else for you. Well, they get in the boat, and verse 14, the disciples had, it says, forgotten to take bread. They did not have more than just one loaf with them in the boat. And Jesus turned and he said to the disciples, now you be careful or take heed of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod, or the Herodians, if you will. And they reasoned amongst themselves, and they said, we don't have any bread. So the rapid departure of Jesus caught the boys by surprise. They hadn't had time to get supplies. They apparently only had one loaf of bread on board, which, by the way, if they were thinking, would have been plenty to feed 13 hungry guys. The Lord seemed to do well with multiplication. In any event, Jesus turns to them and says, because of the confrontation on the shore, which just lasted a few minutes, be careful or be on guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of the Herodians, or of Herod, or if you will, of the Sadducees, the humanists. Be careful. Now, to any good Jew, leaven is the yeast that you put in dough so that it will rise. It became a symbol in the Bible of sin. Leaven, you only need a little bit of yeast to affect the whole lump of dough. It kind of insidiously spreads itself out. It's hard to get rid of once it's in there. And it becomes a type of sin getting in our lives and affecting everything we do. In fact, on the Passover, one of the things that Jewish families would have to do is sweep the house of leaven. Just get rid of the leaven. Take care of the sin. Put it aside, if you will. And it was left out of certain sacrifices and all. Well, Jesus warned of the sinful influence of the Pharisees. He just had run into them, and of the Herodians that he had just listened to. And he says to the disciples, now you be careful. Don't eat any of that. Don't buy into that. Don't let that become a part of your life. He had just been the bread of life feeding the 4,000. It's harmful to your spiritual life. And as soon as the disciples heard the word leaven, they immediately thought of bread. And they said to each other, oh man, we didn't bring lunch. Really? You knuckleheads. Is that really what the Lord is saying? One loaf and a prayer and everyone eats. In fact, we'll get so much bread the boat will sink. Their real problem was much like ours. We're not applying in the present tense what we should have learned well in the past. And I want to challenge you with that. I know you sit in church every week. What are you learning? What really do you take away? Because it's not good enough to go, well, good, he didn't go too long and he was pretty funny. That really doesn't do you much good. I mean, what is the Lord teaching you that is causing you to change? What are you not taking to heart in such a way that God is going to have to repeatedly teach you? Repetition is always for our benefit. Peter, in his last letter to the saints that were scattered, says, I never want to neglect to remind you of all of these things, though you know them and you are established in that present truth. I just got to remind you. It's a necessary part of our spiritual growth. I stir you up by way of reminding your pure minds. That's what he said. And Jesus finds himself doing the same with the disciples. And like I said, every time I shake my head at the disciples, I look up and I see the Lord shaking his head at me. I told you. And you're such a slow learner. It is common for us to practice recall. I got up this morning, and and was reading through Psalm 63, one of my favorite Psalms, and I got up this morning at 8 o'clock and I said, let's read Psalm 63, and I started reading out of Psalm 62. And I finished the first verse, and people went like this. What's wrong? It's your turn. Wrong chapter. I'm just not good at remembering things. I had just read it and went right to the wrong one. How is that possible? If you don't pay attention and make it a point to grab hold of the truth and make it your own, you are doomed to learn it again. You are absolutely stuck. Past victories are no assurance that your faith won't tremble next time. So you've got to learn a truth so well that it becomes a part of your life. Then God has done something. He's given you something you can walk with and rely on. It affects your practice. And some of us need extra help in learning because we are not very quick to learn. These guys were pretty dense, weren't they? I mean, aren't you shaking your head when you read it? Oh, man, you guys, how disappointing you must be. If you were Jesus, what would you say to them at this point? You're just telling them, hey, be careful of those religious guys and what they're feeding you. And they're going, yeah, we didn't bring lunch. Oh, my gosh. Well, here's what Jesus does, beginning in verse 17. He bangs these dense skulls over the head by asking them a rapid series of questions. There happen to be 9 here, designated to bring them to their spiritual sense. It reminds me of God taking Job on, beginning in chapter 37, when Job has just been going through it, and for 4 chapters asking him 50 rhetorical questions designed to remind Job of what he should have learned and how precious little he knew compared to the God that he served. Where were you when I hung the stars on nothing, Job? Yeah, I wasn't there. Where were you when the angels of God shouted for joy and when I set the markers for the waves to only come this far and no further? Hey, Job, where were you? Tell me if you know. And Job just going, oh, man, I should have just trusted the Lord. Well, here's Jesus' questions. Jesus being aware of it. What is it? Being aware of verse 16, that their argument had completely missed Jesus' warning, and they worried about the bread. And he said, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not perceive nor understand? Is your heart still darkened? You have eyes, but you don't see, and ears, you don't hear? Do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of fragments did you take up? They said 12. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets of fragments did you take up? They said 7. Have you ever been taught by this method? If I've told you once, my father used to say, I've told you 1,000 times. How many times do I have to tell you to clean your room? What did I say would happen to you if you didn't do that? He was good at questions. What did your mom say? Go ask your father. Look, Jesus is rarely this stern with the disciples. You can only find a couple of times where it really gets in their face. But he says to them, how long are you going to stay this way? How dull can you be? It's been over 2 years. Where have you guys been? He uses the words perceive. The word perceive means to think something through. Whereas the word understand means having thought it through, I can now put it together in my mind. 1 + 1, it's got to be 2. I understand what you're saying because I've perceived what you're pointing to. And he says, your heart is still callous. That's what the word for hard is, or hard to penetrate. Why are you discussing bread? Don't you think it through? Are you really this dull in heart? Bang, bang, bang. Look, the hearts of the disciples were not hard because they didn't love Jesus. They did. Their hearts were hard because they didn't take in what he'd given them. If you continually run up against the truth and don't internalize it, your heart will get hard. I've heard it 100 times. I've seen it 1,000 times. I can't begin to tell you. If we do a study on Sunday morning on worry and how you don't need to do that, let the Lord handle it, invariably there'll be 10 counseling appointments the next week with people worrying. I'm really worried, Pastor. Where were you on Sunday? Well, it's like in the 8th row, second service, right there. Really? Go back and listen to it again. End of conversation. 3-minute counseling. I'm done. It's the Bob Newhart approach to counseling. Stop it. I can't believe that you can actually just spend 40 minutes talking to people about a few verses and they walk away as if they haven't heard them at all. But it happens because we're not quick at listening. The hearts of the disciples were hard because the repeated exposure of his teaching had left them without reflection or application. They heard it, they saw it, it meant nothing to them. And so they hadn't grown. You can experience hardness and sit in church every week. You can hear but not apply, don't remember, don't meditate, don't take it to heart, don't take it permanently. Use it or lose it, man. That's the way it works. Jesus said, whoever has, to him more will be given. He will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. That's pretty much the issue. So they didn't see, they didn't hear, they weren't listening, they weren't perceiving, they weren't understanding. The Lord said, really? He said in verse 17, how is it you still don't understand this? He even quotes in verse 18 directly out of Ezekiel chapter 12, living in the presence of God, failing to see and hear the word of God, and not remembering the things of God. How many baskets? 12. How many baskets? 7. Okay, so you were there. How come that didn't matter to you? You remember the details. It didn't change you. Why isn't it you can't pull this together and hear and grow in faith? Look, there's no better shield against spiritual dullness than remembering and applying. Before we close, let me give you one good example of that. When Joshua was handed the leadership of the children of Israel, 3 million souls or so, to lead them into the land of promise. When they crossed the Jordan, one of the things that the Lord said to Joshua was, tell the priest to go dig 12 large rocks out of the Jordan River. And I want you to put them on this side and build them as an altar of remembrance to remind the people of who got them here and how they got here. And they named the name of the place Gilgal, and the word Gilgal meant reproach has been rolled away. God has delivered you from your life in the wilderness. He's delivered you to the land. 40 years of wandering, they put up the stones, they sing and they dance, and they marvel at the wonderful work of God. And for Joshua, a young guy, who is now taking over for Moses, this pillar of stones along the banks of the Jordan became this representation to him of what God had done for these 3 million people. And for the next 7.5 years, as the nation fought together to rid the nation of the land of the Canaanites, and then they were assigned, portions of the land to take care of it on their own. For the next 7.5 years, Joshua would come back to Gilgal a lot. It would become his center of operations. He would come here after he won battles, which was most of the time. He even came here a few times when he was defeated, just to remind himself of what God had done. This became to him a place of remembrance. Look, you need Gilgals in your life, where you just remember what God has done and it moves you forward. Not physical stones to stare at, but a mind and a heart filled with lessons learned in the past that keep you going in the future. And unless they get in, you're bound to have to learn them again. Now, Matthew tells us at the end of chapter 16, or in the middle, I guess, but at the end of this story, that they realized that Jesus wasn't talking about bread, but of the leaven of the doctrine of the scribes and Pharisees. And then they went, oh, we get it. Well, no, they didn't get it. We're going to continue with them to see how slowly they get it. But the Lord would rather us learn through the process. And I hope you're not ever learning, but never coming to the knowledge of the truth. If you hear a study about praying, but your praying doesn't change, if you hear a study about studying the Bible, but your studying of the scriptures hasn't changed at all, then it doesn't do you any good. And like we shake our head at these boys thinking they could never get it, the Lord is going to shake his head at you. And I don't want you to have to stand before the Lord one day and get like 150 questions. Job only got 50. The boys got 9. I don't want any. I just want to hear, well done, come on in, that's it, good. Father, that your truth might confront our lives in such a way that it changes our hearts. And that we might remember, seeing that this story is so similar to one that had taken place several months earlier, that we all would think that the disciples would get it right away, that they would understand it, they would know it, it would matter to them, it would make a big difference, and yet it didn't. And slowly and ever so slowly, they began to grow, and it is certainly the same for us. But Lord, we don't want to be in that place where we have to learn the same lessons over and over. May we know you and know truly what you've said and done, and may we embrace those things so that when the 4,000 are hungry, we will remember that the 5,000 were fed by the grace and the power and the mercy of God. And we'll be able to say, Lord, you can do this. It's impossible with us. But the disciples were so slow to learn, and we see ourselves in them. I'm sure that you set them before us as our example, that we need to learn and listen and apply. and understand and perceive. Because the disciples were there, they had the details. It just hadn't left an impression on their life. Look, you may be in church every week, but if it's not leaving an impression on you, then something's wrong. And I would suggest to you, it's all about learning the lesson, taking and applying what you have learned and living it out, standing fast on the truth and being delivered by it. Then the Word of God and the truth of God sets you free, and you'll be free indeed. But if you're just listening, you're recording, yeah, there were 12 baskets, there were 7 people, there were 7 baskets, there was 5,000, there was 4,000. If that's all you have, then you haven't learned a thing. You've got all the information and no understanding, no perception. I hope when you come to church, you'll say, Lord, speak to me. And when he does that, you'll go and do what he says. It'll be good for you, good for those around you, and it'll bless the Lord. And he won't have to shake his head at you or formulate a bunch of questions to ask you so you'll grow up. If you need prayer this morning, some of the pastors will be up front. We'd love to pray with you. Ask the Lord to bless you. But may I encourage you, remember what you hear and apply it to your life. Let's stand together and sing this last song before we go home.